The date was March 15th, 1944, when Oberleutnant Klaus Becker first understood that Germany had already lost the war. It wasn't on a battlefield. It wasn't in a briefing room being told about another lost city or retreating army. It was standing in stunned silence on the tarmac of the Willow Run plant in Michigan, watching a B-24 Liberator roll off the assembly line every 63 minutes. Becker, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot with 47 combat missions and 11 confirmed kills, had been shot down over France 2 weeks earlier. After processing through multiple POW camps, he and 15 other captured German aircrew, including bomber pilots, navigators, and engineers, had been selected for what US intelligence called a special educational tour. The Americans wanted their prisoners to see something. They wanted them to understand what they were fighting against. The bus carrying the German POWs had departed from their camp near Detroit before dawn. None of them knew their destination. They'd been told only to prepare for a facility inspection. Most assumed it would be some propaganda exercise, a staged demonstration meant to demoralize them. They'd heard stories from other POWs about Americans exaggerating their production capabilities, showing them the same aircraft multiple times from different angles to inflate numbers. Becker sat in the back of the bus, watching the flat Michigan landscape roll past in the early morning darkness. Next to him was Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a bomber pilot who'd flown Heinkel 111s over Britain in 1940 and Junkers 88s over Russia in 1942. Weber had 156 combat missions in his logbook before being shot down during a raid on Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. They'd been discussing quietly in German, which their guards made no effort to stop, about the state of the war. Both men knew Germany's situation was deteriorating. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Italy had surrendered. Allied bombers were systematically destroying German cities and industries. But both men still believed Germany could achieve some kind of negotiated peace. After all, they reasoned, the Allies couldn't maintain their bombing campaign indefinitely. Aircraft losses were mounting. Surely American production, despite its reputation, had limits. The bus slowed as dawn broke, turning onto a vast industrial complex that stretched as far as they could see. The sign at the entrance read, Willow Run Bomber Plant, Ford Motor Company. The Germans exchanged glances. They knew Ford, of course. German military trucks were based on Ford designs. But a motor company building aircraft? It seemed absurd. What Becker saw as the bus approached made his breath catch in his throat. The main building was simply impossible. It stretched across the horizon like a geometric mountain range, a structure so enormous that his mind struggled to process its scale. Later, he would learn the measurements: 1.2 miles long, a quarter-mile wide, covering 67 acres under a bus, single roof, the largest single factory building ever constructed at that time. But standing there in that moment, staring through the bus window, all Becker could think was that this one building was larger than some German towns he'd flown over. The German POWs were led inside through a side entrance, accompanied by US Army guards and several officers who would serve as their guides. Major Robert Henderson, their primary escort, had flown B-17s over Germany and had a direct, almost brutal honesty that Becker would later recall as more effective than any propaganda could have been. "Gentlemen," Henderson said in passable German, "what you're about to see is not a show. This is one of several facilities producing bombers for the US Army Air Forces. Everything you see here is standard production. We're not hiding anything. We're not staging anything. We want you to understand exactly what you're fighting against." They entered onto an observation platform overlooking the main assembly line, and Klaus Becker's world changed forever. The factory floor stretched away in both directions beyond his field of vision, disappearing into points too distant to see clearly. But what shattered every assumption he'd held about American industry wasn't the size, it was the motion. The entire vast space was alive with purposeful activity that flowed like a mechanical river. He watched a bare fuselage frame enter his field of vision from the left, moving on a production line. As it travelled down the assembly floor, it transformed before his eyes. Workers swarmed over it at precisely choreographed stations. Skin panels were riveted into place with pneumatic tools that created a constant percussion rhythm, echoing through the enormous space. Electrical systems were installed, hydraulic lines connected, fuel tanks fitted, instrument panels mounted. The transformation happened with such smooth precision that it seemed almost organic, like watching a skeleton acquire muscle and skin. What stunned Becker most was the speed. This wasn't the careful, methodical aircraft construction he knew from German factories, where skilled craftsmen painstakingly assembled each aircraft over weeks. This was something else entirely. Industrial production applied to aerial warfare with efficiency that seemed almost inhuman. Major Henderson pointed down at the assembly line. That fuselage entered final assembly 6 hours ago as a bare frame. In 8 more hours, it will taxi out of this building as a complete B-24 Liberator ready for flight testing. 1 aircraft every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're currently producing 450 B-24s per month from this single facility. Becker did the mental calculation automatically. 450 bombers per month. That was more than Germany's entire bomber production across all factories combined, from one building. He must have made some sound, some involuntary expression of disbelief, because Henderson continued, last. Year 1943, the United States produced 29,355 military aircraft. Bombers, fighters, transports, trainers. This year will exceed 40,000. Next year we're projected to reach 50,000. Friedrich Weber, standing beside Becker, spoke for the first time. Impossible. No nation could achieve such production. We have intelligence reports. Major Henderson smiled, but there was no humour in it. Your intelligence reports are wrong. Let me show you why. They descended from the observation platform and walked onto the factory floor itself. The noise was overwhelming. Thousands of pneumatic riveters creating a sound like endless metallic rainfall. The whine of electric motors, the hiss of hydraulic systems, the clang of metal on metal, the shouts of foremen coordinating their crews. But beneath the chaos was something that frightened Becker more than the noise. It was the rhythm, the purpose, the absolute precision of thousands of workers performing their tasks in perfect synchronization. Henderson led them to a station where workers were installing wing sections. These aren't aircraft craftsmen, he said. Most of these workers had never seen an airplane before 1942. That woman there, he pointed to a middle-aged woman expertly operating a large riveting machine. She was a schoolteacher. That man was a farmer. That young guy was pumping gas at a service station. Ford trained them in weeks, sometimes days, to perform specific tasks. They're not building complete aircraft. They're performing one operation perfectly, thousands of times. Weber was staring at the woman with the riveting machine. She moved with practiced efficiency that suggested years of experience, not months. How long has she been doing this, he asked. Henderson checked a clipboard. 5 months. She can install a wing root section in 14 minutes. The German specification for the same operation is 40 minutes, and that's with a fully trained airframe mechanic. The implications crashed over Becker like a physical weight. Germany's aircraft production depended on skilled craftsmen, men who'd trained for years to work on aircraft. Men who were increasingly being drafted into combat units because Germany was running out of soldiers. America was training housewives and farmers to build bombers in weeks, and they were doing it faster than German experts. They walked the length of the assembly line, watching bombers take shape with terrifying efficiency. Henderson provided a running commentary, his voice matter-of-fact, almost casual, which somehow made the information more devastating. The Willow Run plant employed 42,000 workers at peak production. 3 shifts, round the clock. The factory never stops. When one shift goes home, the next is already at their stations. The production line never pauses. Parts are delivered on a precise schedule, timed to the minute. If a parts delivery is late, it disrupts the entire line, so we've developed supply chain management that Germany won't achieve for decades. At one station, they watched wings being joined to a fuselage. The operation required precise alignment and hundreds of rivets. A crew of 8 workers completed it in 22 minutes. Becker had watched similar operations at Messerschmitt factories. It took a full day with specialized jigs and skilled craftsmen. How? Weber asked simply. Henderson gestured to the tools, the jigs, the carefully designed workstations. Standardization. Every B-24 is identical. Every part is interchangeable. Every operation is analyzed, timed, optimized. Henry Ford didn't invent mass production, but he perfected it with automobiles. Now we've applied those same principles to aircraft. Your factories build airplanes. We manufacture them. They reached the end of the assembly line where completed bombers sat in final inspection bays. Workers were performing systems checks, installing guns, adding fuel. These aircraft would be flown out that afternoon to modification centres where they'd receive final combat equipment before being ferried to Europe or the Pacific. Becker counted 12 complete bombers in the bay. Tomorrow there would be 12 more, the day after 12 more, an endless stream of 4-engine bombers, each one destined to drop tons of high explosives on Germany. Oberleutnant Hans Steiner, a bomber pilot who'd remained mostly silent during the tour, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost defeated. "How many of these factories do you have?" Henderson consulted his clipboard, though Becker suspected he knew the numbers by heart. For B-24 Liberator specifically, Willow Run is the largest, but Consolidated operates plants in San Diego and Fort Worth. Douglas has a plant in Tulsa. We're producing B-24s at 5 major facilities. Total B-24 production will exceed 18,000 aircraft by war's end. 18,000, Steiner repeated. 18,000 heavy bombers of one type. Henderson nodded. The B-17 Flying Fortress is being produced at Boeing plants in Seattle and Wichita, Douglas in Long Beach, and Lockheed Vega in Burbank. Total B-17 production will exceed 12,000. Then there's the B-29 Super Fortress, which is larger and more advanced than anything currently in service. Boeing, Martin, and Bell are producing those. We expect about 4,000 B-29s by war's end. So between 3 bomber types, you're producing, Weber paused, doing the math, over 34,000 heavy bombers. That's just heavy bombers, Henderson said. Medium bombers, the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder, will produce about 11,000 of each. Light bombers and attack aircraft, another 10,000. The numbers kept coming, each one a hammer blow against everything the German officers had believed about the war. Fighters, Henderson continued. The P-47 Thunderbolt, over 15,000. The P-51 Mustang, about 16,000. The P-38 Lightning, 10,000. Navy fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, about 12,000 each. Transport aircraft, the C-47 and C-46, about 13,000 combined. Training aircraft, liaison planes, reconnaissance birds, another 20,000. Becker had stopped trying to keep track. The numbers were simply too large to process. Germany's entire aircraft production from 1939 to 1944 was approximately 90,000 aircraft of all types. The United States was producing that many in less than 2 years. And that's just aircraft, Henderson said. Engines, we're producing about 250,000 aircraft engines per year. Propellers, instruments, radios, gun turrets, bomb sights, all manufactured in dedicated facilities applying the same mass production principles you've seen here. They were led to a side building where engines were being prepared for installation. Rows of Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each producing 2,100 horsepower, sat on stands being tested. The noise was deafening. 18-cylinder radial engines running at full throttle, dozens of them, filling the space with thunder. Each B-24 requires 4 engines, Henderson explained, shouting over the noise. We test every engine before installation. Failures are rare, less than 1%, but we can't risk engine failure on a combat bomber, so we run them hard here. If they're going to fail, better it happens in Michigan than over Germany. That comment, so casual, so practical, hammered home another reality. These Americans weren't just building aircraft in massive numbers, they were building them well. With quality control, testing and reliability that German production, strained to the breaking point, could no longer match. As they left the engine testing facility, Henderson led them to a parking area where buses were loading workers from the night shift. "Look at them," Henderson said. The Germans watched hundreds of workers, men and women, young and old, black and white, boarding buses in orderly lines. These people are winning the war, not generals, not politicians. These workers, building bombers and tanks and ships and guns. America has a population of 140 million. We've mobilized about 16 million for military service. That leaves 124 million civilians. A huge portion of them are working in war industries. Germany, Henderson continued, has a population of about 70 million in the Reich proper, plus occupied territories you're exploiting. But you're fighting a multi-front war against enemies with combined populations exceeding 500 million. The Soviet Union alone has more people than Germany and all its occupied territories combined. You're outnumbered, outproduced, and that gap grows wider every day. Becker wanted to argue, to defend his nation, but he couldn't. The evidence surrounded him. The massive factory, the endless production, the casual efficiency of it all. This wasn't propaganda. This was reality. The tour continued at the Ford River Rouge complex, another staggering industrial facility that produced steel, engines and components for the Willow Run plant. The Germans watched raw materials enter one end, iron ore, coal, limestone, and finished engines emerge from the other. The entire process from ore to installed engine took less than 48 hours. It was vertical integration on a scale that simply didn't exist in Germany. At River Rouge, they saw something that disturbed Becker even more than the production numbers. In one section, workers were melting down scrap metal, recycling damaged parts and production waste. An American officer explained that recycling programs throughout the country were collecting metal, rubber, and other materials from civilians. Housewives were saving cooking grease. Children were collecting scrap. Every bit of material was being channeled into war production. Germany had similar programs, of course, but seeing the American scale was different. These people weren't scraping by, sacrificing necessities. They were voluntarily contributing to a war production effort that already dwarfed anything Germany could achieve. They weren't driven by desperation. They were driven by purpose. After River Rouge, the POWs were taken to the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, another massive facility producing M4 Sherman tanks. The production philosophy was identical. Assembly line manufacturing, standardized components, workers trained in specific tasks, continuous production. Tanks rolled off the line every 15 minutes during peak shifts. The German officers watched in silence. Hauptmann Weber finally asked the question that had been growing in all their minds. "Why are you showing us this?" Major Henderson's response was simple. "Because when this war ends, you'll go home. Some of you will talk about what you saw. Some will write about it. Some will teach the next generation. We want you to understand why Germany lost. Not because German soldiers weren't brave, not because German generals weren't skilled, but because you challenged nations with industrial capacity you couldn't match. You started a production war against countries that could outbuild you 10 to 1, and production wars are won by production." That night, back at the POW camp, Becker sat in his bunk and tried to write a letter to his wife. Censors would read it, of course, and certain information would be redacted. But he needed to put his thoughts into words, to process what he'd seen. He wrote about the factories, trying to convey the scale, knowing his descriptions would sound like exaggeration. He wrote about the workers, ordinary Americans building extraordinary numbers of weapons with what seemed like casual ease. He wrote about the assembly lines that never stopped, the rhythm of production that flowed day and night without pause. What he didn't write, what he couldn't put into words, was the profound despair he felt. Klaus Becker was 26 years old. He'd joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, had flown fighters in France, in Britain, over the Mediterranean. He'd believed in German technical superiority, in the skill of German pilots and the quality of German aircraft. He'd believed that even if Germany was outnumbered, superior training and technology would prevail. The factories had destroyed those beliefs. German aircraft were good, sometimes excellent, but individual quality meant nothing against unlimited quantity. The Messerschmitt 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, even the new jet fighters, what did any of that matter when America could produce 100 aircraft for every one Germany built? Over the following weeks, other German POWs were taken on similar tours. Some visited Boeing plants in Seattle where B-17s were being produced. Others saw North American aviation facilities building P-51 Mustangs. Still others toured shipyards where Liberty ships, those mass-produced cargo vessels, were being completed in less than 2 weeks from keel laying to launch. Each group returned to their camps with the same stunned expression, the same inability to fully articulate what they'd witnessed. Oberst Martin Richter, a Luftwaffe officer who'd commanded a fighter wing before being shot down in 1944, was among those who toured the Boeing plant. He'd been a professional officer since 1935, had fought in Poland, France and Russia. He'd received the Knight's Cross for his combat record. He considered himself a realist about Germany's strategic situation. But the Boeing plant broke something in him. He wrote in a diary that would later be captured and translated, "We were fools. We thought we were fighting a war. We were fighting against the future. These Americans have created something we never imagined. Not just factories, but an entire philosophy of production. They've industrialized warfare in ways that make our efforts seem medieval. Every part standardized, every process optimized, every worker trained to peak efficiency. And they're doing it without strain, without desperation. They're doing it as naturally as breathing. I watched B-17s take shape, like crops growing in a field. Steady, inevitable, unstoppable. I watched workers, many of them women, performing tasks that would require master craftsmen in Germany. I watched metal become aircraft in hours instead of weeks, and I understood we never had a chance. Not because we weren't brave enough or skilled enough, because we were playing a different game entirely. We were fighting World War I while they were fighting World War II. Some German prisoners refused to believe what they'd seen. They convinced themselves it was elaborate propaganda, that the Americans had staged everything, that the production numbers were lies. These men clung to their beliefs, insisting that Germany would still prevail through superior will and fighting spirit. But they were the minority. Most prisoners who'd seen the factories couldn't deny reality. The scale was too vast, the evidence too overwhelming. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, the bomber pilot who'd flown over Britain and Russia, became something of a spokesman among the POWs for accepting reality. In the camp barracks, he'd explain what they'd seen to prisoners who hadn't toured the factories. Some of you think what we're telling you is exaggerated, he'd say. Some think it's propaganda designed to break our morale. I wish that were true. I wish I could tell you that German production is matching the Americans, that our new weapons will turn the tide, that victory is still possible. I can't. The truth is simple and terrible. America is producing more aircraft in a month than Germany produces in half a year. They're doing it from factories so large that our entire aviation industry could fit inside single buildings. They're doing it with workers who learnt their trades in weeks, building aircraft faster and often better than our master craftsmen can. This isn't about courage or skill anymore. It's about mathematics. Germany cannot match American production. We cannot replace our losses. We cannot sustain a war of attrition against an enemy that can absorb any losses and continue producing. The only question now is how long the war continues and how many more Germans die before we accept the inevitable. Weber's speeches weren't welcomed by camp hardliners, the dedicated Nazis who maintained that Germany would prevail through faith and determination. Several times, arguments nearly became physical confrontations. But Weber had the advantage of truth. Men who'd seen the factories couldn't unhear the rhythm of production, couldn't forget the sight of bombers rolling off assembly lines in an endless stream. Klaus Becker found himself thinking about specific details from the tour. The woman who'd been a schoolteacher, now riveting wing sections with expert precision. The sound of dozens of engines being tested simultaneously. The parking lots full of workers' cars, showing that these factory employees could afford personal automobiles during a war. That detail bothered him particularly. In Germany, civilian automobile production had ceased entirely. Vehicles were luxury items reserved for essential purposes, but in America, factory workers drove their own cars to plants where they built bombers. The disparity wasn't just in production capacity, it was in fundamental wealth and resources. The POW camps held thousands of German prisoners, and as more arrived from various fronts, they brought stories of encountering American material superiority in combat. Luftwaffe pilots talked about facing P-47 and P-51 formations that seemed endless. Tank crews described being overwhelmed by Sherman tanks that kept coming despite losses. Infantry soldiers spoke of American artillery that never seemed to run out of ammunition. Every story confirmed the same truth. America wasn't just fighting. They were burying Germany under an avalanche of production. One Luftwaffe mechanic, Unteroffizier Hans Krebs, who'd maintained fighters on the Eastern Front before being captured in France, provided a ground-level perspective. In Russia, we learned to cannibalize 3 broken aircraft to create 1 working fighter. We scavenged parts from wrecks. We improvised repairs with whatever materials we could find. When we needed replacement engines, we'd wait weeks or months for deliveries that often never came. At our airfield, we had maybe 60% of our fighters operational on a good day. The Americans, from what I've heard from pilots who fought them, don't have these problems. They have spare parts for everything. They replace damaged aircraft immediately. If an engine fails, they don't repair it. They install a new one. They operate with abundance while we operate with scarcity. An army officer, Hauptmann Georg Fischer, who'd fought in Normandy before capture, added his perspective. In the first week after the invasion, I watched American supply convoys moving inland, endless trucks, each one identical, carrying ammunition, fuel, food, equipment. They built a supply network in days that would have taken us weeks. When we destroyed vehicles, they replaced them faster than we could kill them. I saw a truck hit by Panzerfaust, completely destroyed. 2 hours later, an identical truck was using the same route. We weren't fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial machine that could replace any loss instantly. The psychological impact on German POWs was profound and varied. Some sank into depression, realizing their sacrifices had been for a lost cause. Others felt relief, understanding that their captivity meant they'd survived an unwinnable war. Still others directed anger at German leadership for starting a conflict against opponents with such overwhelming advantages. Klaus Becker found himself in a strange mental space. He'd been proud to serve, proud to be a fighter pilot, proud of his skills and victories. But that pride now seemed hollow. What did his 11 kills matter against American production of 15,000 fighters? His personal skill, his courage, his training, all of it was meaningless against industrial mathematics. He thought about his fallen comrades, skilled pilots who died in combat. Had they died for nothing? Defending a nation that had challenged enemies it couldn't possibly defeat. The questions haunted him. Major Henderson had arranged for several POWs, including Becker, to watch a documentary film about American war production. It was meant for American audiences, showing civilians how their efforts contributed to victory. The Germans watched footage of factories across America, aircraft plants, shipyards, tank arsenals, ammunition factories. The film showed women working in factories, replacing men who'd joined the military. It showed assembly lines stretching beyond sight. It showed the statistics, presented proudly for American viewers, but devastating for German prisoners. One segment focused on Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that carried supplies to Europe. The narrator explained that American shipyards were producing one Liberty ship every day. Every single day, a new 4x1-foot cargo vessel capable of carrying 10,000 tons. The Germans watched footage of a ship being completed in less than 5 days as a publicity stunt. 5 days from keel to launch for an ocean-going cargo vessel. Hauptmann Weber, watching beside Becker, whispered, "We're losing because they can build ships in less time than we can unload one." The film showed aircraft production numbers with casual pride. In 1943, America produced over 85,000 aircraft of all types. The projection for 1944 was over 96,000. The narrator mentioned these numbers as achievements to celebrate. To the German prisoners, they were execution notices. Those aircraft were flying over Germany right now, dropping bombs on German cities, killing German civilians, destroying what remained of German industry. Another segment showed ammunition production. Lake City Arsenal producing 30 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per month. Twin Cities Arsenal producing artillery shells by the millions. The narrator explained that America was producing enough small arms ammunition to supply 50 shots per enemy soldier for every American serviceman. The logistics were incomprehensible, not just building weapons, but creating supply networks to deliver those weapons to combat zones thousands of miles away. Klaus Becker learned that the bombs falling on German cities weren't just numerous. They were specifically designed and mass-produced for maximum destruction. Incendiary bombs, high-explosive bombs, even specialized bombs for different targets. All manufactured in quantities that allowed bombardiers to destroy entire city blocks in single raids. The film ended with a montage of American military might. Bomber formations darkening the sky, tank columns stretching to the horizon, Navy vessels crowding harbours, rows of fighters on airfield tarmacs, all of it produced by American factories working around the clock. The narrator's final line stayed with Becker. "America's production is the sword that will win this war. Our workers are soldiers on the factory floor and they're winning battles every day." When the lights came on, none of the German prisoners spoke immediately. They filed out silently, each processing what they'd seen. Back in the barracks, Becker lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the war's beginning, the confidence everyone had felt. Germany had the best trained army, the most experienced air force, the most advanced tactics. They'd defeated Poland in weeks, France in months. They'd seemed invincible, but they'd made a fatal miscalculation. They'd measured success in battlefield victories, not production capacity. They'd assumed that tactical brilliance could overcome strategic disadvantage. They'd believed that quality could defeat quantity indefinitely. The Americans had understood something different. Wars weren't won by individual heroes or superior tactics alone. Modern industrial wars were won by logistics, production, and the ability to absorb losses while continuing to expand military power. America had built a war machine that could sustain any casualties, replace any losses, and continue expanding until victory was achieved. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't built on martial tradition or military culture. It was built on factories, assembly lines, and industrial management, and it was unstoppable. Over subsequent months, as more prisoners arrived and shared their experiences, the picture became clearer. The Eastern Front prisoners talked about endless Soviet armies, equipped increasingly with American trucks and weapons provided through Lend-Lease. British prisoners talked about serving alongside Americans, whose equipment surpassed British production in both quality and quantity. Prisoners from Italy described supply situations so dire that German units were using captured weapons because their own supplies had stopped arriving. Every story confirmed the same reality. Germany was being ground down by opponents who could outlast them economically. In September 1944, news reached the POW camps about the Allied landings in southern France and the rapid advance across France following the Normandy breakthrough. The speed of Allied movement was enabled by fuel, ammunition, and supplies that never seemed to run short. American units advanced with logistics trains that kept them supplied even hundreds of miles from ports. The German army, by contrast, was increasingly immobile due to fuel shortages and lack of transportation. Oberst Richter, the fighter wing commander, explained it to a group of recently captured prisoners. "You're thinking tactically. Why didn't our forces stop them here or there? You're asking the wrong questions. The real question is, how could we stop them? They have unlimited fuel. We're rationing every litre. They have ammunition for sustained combat. We're counting individual shells. They replace damaged vehicles overnight. Ours sit broken for weeks waiting for parts that never arrive. You can't win battles when your enemy has 10 times your supplies and can replace losses you can't match." The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought news of Germany's last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Initial reports brought hope to some prisoners. German forces had broken through American lines, captured equipment, taken prisoners. Some hardliners in the camps insisted this proved Germany could still win. But Klaus Becker and others who understood industrial realities knew better. The offensive, even if initially successful, couldn't be sustained. Germany had committed its last reserves, burned precious fuel, and exhausted ammunition stockpiles for a battle that, even if won tactically, changed nothing strategically. Within weeks, news confirmed what the realists expected. The offensive had stalled. American forces, recovering from initial surprise, had contained and then reversed German gains. More significantly, Americans had replaced their losses almost immediately. Divisions battered in the initial assault were reinforced and re-equipped within days. German forces, by contrast, couldn't replace their casualties and had exhausted supplies that couldn't be replenished. Major Henderson visited the camp in January 1945 and spoke with several of the prisoners who'd toured the factories. He brought updated production figures. In 1944, America produced 96 Soul and 318 aircraft. He paused to let that number sink in. That's more aircraft in 1 year than Germany has produced in the entire war. We also produced 17,000 tanks, 8 million tons of naval vessels, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and 434 million tons of steel. Our factories are running at full capacity. We can sustain this production indefinitely. Henderson pulled out a newspaper and showed them a photograph. "This is the Willow Run plant you visited. It's currently producing a B-24 every 55 minutes. We've improved efficiency since your tour. The factory runs 3 shifts without interruption. If we wanted, we could increase production further, but we don't need to. Current production exceeds requirements. We're building bombers faster than we can train crews to fly them." That last detail was perhaps most devastating. America's bottleneck wasn't production. It was training humans fast enough to use the weapons rolling off assembly lines. Klaus Becker received a letter from his wife in February 1945. It had been censored heavily, but enough remained to understand conditions in Germany. She wrote about food shortages, about cities being bombed night and day, about refugees fleeing from the Eastern Front as Soviet forces advanced. She wrote about factories that had stopped producing because workers were being drafted, or because bombing had destroyed machinery. She didn't say it directly, but Becker understood. Germany was collapsing, not from lack of will or courage, but from simple exhaustion. The nation had nothing left to give. In March, news reached the camps about American forces crossing the Rhine. The final barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland had fallen. More significantly, prisoners arriving from recent captures talked about German units with no fuel, no ammunition, soldiers armed with whatever weapons they could find. The army was disintegrating not from defeat in battle, but from inability to sustain itself. Hauptmann Weber, discussing the situation with other prisoners, put it simply: "We lost this war in 1941 when we invaded Russia while still fighting Britain. We lost it again in 1942 when America entered fully mobilized. Everything since then has been delay, not defense. The factories determined the outcome before most battles were fought. The POW camps in America held over 370,000 German prisoners by war's end. Many had been captured in Africa, Italy, France, or Germany itself. They came from all branches of service, all regions of Germany, all social classes. But those who'd toured American factories shared a common understanding that set them apart. They'd seen the source of Allied power. They understood why Germany had lost. When news of Germany's surrender came in May 1945, reactions in the camps were mixed. Some prisoners felt relief that the killing had ended. Others felt shame at defeat. Still others felt anger at leaders who'd led Germany into unwinnable war. But among those who toured the factories there was something else, a kind of grim acceptance that the outcome had been inevitable. Klaus Becker was among prisoners who would remain in America for over a year after war's end, working on farms and in other jobs as part of post-war labor programs. During that time he saw more of American life. He saw prosperity that seemed impossible for a nation at war. He saw stores full of goods while German cities starved. He saw new automobiles being produced even before war production had fully converted back to civilian manufacturing. He saw a nation that had fought a global war on two fronts while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded German peacetime prosperity. In late 1946, Klaus Becker returned to Germany. The journey took him through the devastation of post-war Europe. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, populations displaced and starving, industry collapsed. When he finally reached his hometown, he found it had been bombed repeatedly. His apartment building was a shell. His wife and daughter had survived in a basement shelter but had almost nothing. Germany had been destroyed so completely that reconstruction would take decades. But Becker had seen American factories. He knew why. Germany hadn't been defeated by better tactics or braver soldiers. Germany had been defeated by production capacity so overwhelming that resistance had been futile from the start. The Willow Run plant alone, that single building he'd toured in 1944, had produced more heavy bombers than Germany's entire aviation industry. One American factory had outproduced an entire nation. In the decades after the war, many German veterans would write memoirs, give interviews, and reflect on their experiences. Those who'd toured American factories during their captivity often emphasized the same themes. They hadn't understood what they were fighting against. They'd measured military power in divisions and aircraft squadrons, not in industrial capacity. They'd believed that German quality could overcome Allied quantity. They'd been wrong. Oberst Martin Richter, in a 1967 interview, reflected on his factory tour. "I was a professional soldier. I understood tactics, operations, strategy. I thought I understood war, but I didn't understand industrial war. I didn't understand that modern conflict is decided by production capacity, not battlefield skill. When I saw those assembly lines, when I watched B-17s taking shape every few hours, I realized we'd been fighting the wrong war. We'd prepared for a replay of World War I, a conflict of position and attrition, where superior training and tactics could prevail. Instead, we got World War II, a conflict of production and logistics where the side that could build more weapons faster would inevitably win." Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, who'd become a teacher after the war, often discussed his experiences with students. He'd tell them about the Willow Run plant, about watching bombers roll off the assembly line in an endless stream. He'd explain how American workers, many of them housewives and farmers with minimal training, had built weapons in quantities that professional German craftsmen couldn't match. He'd emphasize the lesson he felt was most important. Wars aren't won by courage alone. They're won by nations that can sustain military operations indefinitely. Germany challenged enemies with combined industrial capacity 10 times our own. The outcome was never in doubt for anyone who understood the numbers. Klaus Becker lived until 1987. In his final years, he gave several interviews about his wartime experiences. When asked about the moment he knew Germany had lost, he always returned to the same memory. Standing on the observation platform at Willow Run, watching that assembly line stretch beyond sight, hearing Major Henderson explain that this was one of many factories producing aircraft in numbers Germany couldn't imagine. That was when I understood, Becker would say. Not when I was shot down, not when I was captured, when I saw what we were fighting against. We challenged a nation that could turn entire horizons into factories, a nation that could train ordinary citizens to build extraordinary weapons in weeks, a nation whose industrial capacity was so vast that they showed it to prisoners because they knew we couldn't do anything with that information. They weren't afraid of us knowing their production numbers because those numbers were so overwhelming that knowledge changed nothing. The tours of American factories were part of a deliberate psychological operations program. US intelligence had determined that German POWs, especially officers and technical personnel, would be more effective at spreading truthful information about American capabilities than any propaganda could be. By showing prisoners the reality of American production, the military ensured that accurate information would eventually reach Germany through letters, through repatriated prisoners, and through post-war communications. The program was remarkably successful. German prisoners who toured factories became the most effective advocates for accepting reality. Their testimony carried weight because they'd seen the evidence firsthand, and because they had no reason to lie to fellow Germans. Intelligence reports from late 1944 noted that letters from POWs describing American factories were having measurable effects on German morale. Soldiers receiving letters from captured comrades began questioning whether continued resistance made sense. Luftwaffe pilots hearing about American production numbers from repatriated wounded began to understand why they faced endless formations of enemy aircraft. The information spread slowly but persistently, undermining the propaganda that insisted Germany could still win through determination and superior will. The factory tours revealed something that went beyond simple production numbers. They revealed a fundamental difference in how America and Germany approached industrial war. German industry, despite its reputation for engineering excellence, remained rooted in traditional manufacturing. Skilled craftsmen building quality products through meticulous processes. It worked well for peacetime production, and even for early war production when Germany wasn't facing peer competitors. American industry had evolved differently. Mass production, standardization, and industrial efficiency weren't just techniques. They were fundamental philosophies. Henry Ford hadn't just found a way to build cars faster. He'd created a manufacturing system that could be applied to virtually any product. That system, refined and expanded during the war, proved superior for military production. The Germans had built excellent aircraft, the Messerschmitt 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, the later jets. These were superb machines designed by brilliant engineers, but excellence in individual design couldn't overcome deficiency in production capacity. America built good aircraft in numbers that buried German excellence under sheer quantity. The B-24 Liberator that Becker watched rolling off the Willow Run assembly line wasn't technically superior to German bombers. It was arguably inferior to the Heinkel 177 in some respects. But America built over 18,000 B-24s, while Germany struggled to produce 1,000 Helmsd U-127s, most of which suffered from technical problems because rushed production couldn't maintain quality standards. The comparison illustrated the fatal flaw in German strategic thinking. They'd optimized for quality in individual platforms while America optimized for quantity in production systems. In a prolonged industrial war, the production system mattered more than the individual platform. This lesson wasn't lost on post-war planners. Both American and Soviet military theorists studied World War II production and concluded that future conflicts would be decided by industrial capacity, even more than past wars had been. The Cold War arms race that followed was fundamentally a competition in production capacity. Who could build more missiles, more aircraft, more tanks, more ships? The answer, as in World War II, was the side with greater industrial infrastructure and more efficient production systems. German engineers and scientists, many of whom came to America after the war, brought technical expertise that contributed to American advancement. But they also brought humility born from defeat. They'd learned that technical brilliance without production capacity was insufficient. They'd learned that wars were won by logistics and manufacturing as much as by tactics and courage. Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist who became crucial to the American space program, once reflected on the difference between German and American approaches. In Germany, we designed the V2 rocket as a technical marvel. We solved incredible engineering problems. We created something that had never existed before. But we could only build them in limited numbers, and the production was vulnerable to bombing. In America, I learned to think differently. How do you design something that can be mass-produced? How do you create systems that are not just technically excellent, but also manufacturable in quantity? That's what won the war. Not the best weapons, but enough weapons that were good enough, produced fast enough to overwhelm any opponent. The POWs who toured American factories carried this lesson home. Klaus Becker, returning to devastated Germany, shared his experiences with anyone who would listen. Some dismissed him as demoralized by captivity. Others argued that he exaggerated to justify defeat. But as Germany began rebuilding, as people saw American aid flowing in through the Marshall Plan, as they recognized the enormous productive capacity helping to reconstruct Europe, more began to understand. The same industrial capacity that had destroyed Germany was now rebuilding it. The factories that had produced bombers were producing tractors and trucks. The assembly lines that had made tanks were making automobiles. The production systems that had armed millions of soldiers were now supplying millions of civilians. In the 1950s, as West Germany developed its own industry under the Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle, German engineers consciously studied American production methods. They visited American factories, not as prisoners now, but as students. They learned about quality control, supply chain management, just-in-time production, and other techniques. They brought these methods home and adapted them to German manufacturing culture. The result was modern German industry, combining traditional German engineering excellence with American production efficiency. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz became global leaders by merging quality craftsmanship with mass production techniques. But those who remembered the war, who'd seen the Willow Run plant producing a bomber per hour, understood what that merger represented. It was acknowledgement that America had been right. Modern industrial war required production systems, not just product excellence. The lesson had been learned through devastating defeat, but it had been learned thoroughly. By the 1960s, when Oberst Richter gave his interview reflecting on the war, he could contextualize what had happened. "We weren't defeated by better soldiers," he said. "The American soldiers we fought were brave and competent, but no braver or more competent than German soldiers. We weren't defeated by better generals. Eisenhower and his staff were skilled, but Rommel and Manstein were their equals in operational art. We were defeated by better logistics." America had created a military supply system that could sustain operations indefinitely at distances that would have been impossible for Germany. Every American soldier at the front was backed by an entire industrial infrastructure designed to keep him supplied, armed, and supported. The statistics supported his assessment. In 1944, the United States produced 17 million tons of steel, specifically for military use. Germany produced 5 million tons total, including civilian needs. American factories consumed 25 million tons of rubber, much of it synthetic, for military vehicles and aircraft. Germany struggled to produce 100,000 tons. American munitions production exceeded $2 billion per month at peak. German production was less than $500 million equivalent. The disparity existed across every category of military production. Small arms, ammunition, vehicles, ships, aircraft, electronics, everything. America outproduced Germany by ratios ranging from 3-1 up to 10-1 depending on the category. More significantly, American production was accelerating even as German production collapsed. In 1945, despite Germany's surrender in May, American factories were prepared to produce even more than they had in 1944. The production infrastructure was still expanding, new factories were under construction, training programs were producing more workers, Supply chains were optimized further. If the war had continued, America could have sustained current production levels indefinitely, while increasing them further if needed. Germany, by contrast, had exhausted its capacity by late 1944. Raw material shortages, bombing damage, loss of occupied territories, and labour shortages meant German production was declining even before the final collapse. The factory tours had shown German POWs this reality in 1944. At the time, some had hoped that new German weapons, the jets and rockets and advanced submarines, would change the equation. But those weapons, technically impressive as they were, came too late and in too few numbers. The Me-262 jet fighter was superior to any Allied aircraft in performance, but Germany produced only about 1,400 of them, and operational challenges meant only a fraction saw combat. Compare that to the 15th 683 P-47 Thunderbolts that America produced, and the futility of German technical superiority becomes clear. Hauptmann Weber, in his post-war teaching, would use this comparison. Imagine you have the best sword ever made, he'd tell students. Perfect balance, perfect edge, superior to any other sword. But your enemy has 1,000 adequate swords. Who wins? Quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own. America didn't need to build the best fighter. They needed to build enough good fighters to overwhelm German defences. They did exactly that. The lesson extended beyond military history. Weber used it to teach about resource management, strategic planning, and the importance of sustainable systems over individual excellence. A business with an adequate product and efficient production will defeat a competitor with a superior product but limited production capacity. A nation with sufficient resources properly managed will outlast a nation with better technology but insufficient resources. These weren't abstract lessons. They were truths learned through Germany's defeat. Klaus Becker, working as an engineer in post-war Germany, applied what he'd learned at Willow Run to civilian manufacturing. He advocated for assembly line production, standardized components, and quality control systems modelled on American practices. His colleagues, many of them fellow veterans who'd seen American industry firsthand, supported these approaches. The rebuilding of German industry was informed by lessons learned through defeat. By the 1970s, a new generation of Germans had grown up with only historical knowledge of the war. They learned about it in schools, from books, from stories their parents and grandparents told. But for them, it was history, not lived experience. The veterans who toured American factories were elderly now. Klaus Becker was in his 50s, Hauptmann Weber in his 60s, Oberst Richter approaching 70. They'd become living links to a past that seemed increasingly distant. When they spoke about their experiences, younger Germans sometimes struggled to grasp the scale they described. A factory over a mile long, a bomber every hour. These numbers seemed exaggerated, the embellishments of old men whose memories had grown fuzzy with time. But the numbers were accurate. Documentary evidence, photographs, production records, all confirmed what the veterans described. The Willow Run plant had indeed been 1.2 miles long. It had indeed produced B-24s at a rate of 1 per hour at peak efficiency. American war production had indeed exceeded everything Germany could achieve by an order of magnitude. In 1984, a German documentary film crew interviewed several veterans who toured American factories during their captivity. The resulting documentary, Die Fabrik, or The Factory, aired on West German television and created significant interest. Younger Germans, seeing footage of wartime American factories and hearing first-hand testimony from men who'd been there, gained new understanding of why Germany had lost. The documentary included footage from American archives showing the Willow Run plant in operation, the Boeing plants producing B-17s, the Chrysler Arsenal building tanks. It showed the assembly lines, the workers, the finished products rolling out in steady streams. It included interviews with American workers who'd been part of that production effort, elderly now, but remembering their contributions with pride. One American woman, now in her 70s, recalled working at Willow Run as a riveter. I was 19 years old, she said. I'd never seen an airplane up close before I started. They trained me for 2 weeks, then put me on the line. My job was to rivet specific sections of the fuselage. Same thing, thousands of times. At first it was just a job, but as I got better, I took pride in it. Every bomber that rolled out had my rivets in it. I knew those planes were going to Europe to fight Hitler. I knew I was part of something important. The The documentary juxtaposed her testimony with that of Klaus Becker, now 67 years old. "When I saw her," he said, or someone like her, working with such skill despite minimal training, I understood everything. Germany needed years to train an aircraft mechanic. America needed weeks to train someone who could do specialized tasks as well as any German mechanic. They'd broken down complex construction into simple operations that anyone could learn. It was brilliant and terrifying. The documentary's impact in Germany was significant. It sparked discussions about industrial capacity, about the nature of modern warfare, about how nations prepared for or avoided conflict. It reminded Germans of lessons learned through catastrophic defeat. Don't start wars you can't sustain. Don't underestimate opponents' industrial capacity. Don't assume that quality can overcome quantity indefinitely. These lessons had shaped post-war German policy. The country had forsworn militarism, had integrated into NATO rather than pursuing independent military power, had focused on economic development rather than military strength. The decisions were rooted in constitutional requirements and political realities, but they were also informed by understanding what happened when Germany challenged opponents with overwhelming industrial advantages. Klaus Becker died in 1987 at age 70. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service, his post-war career as an engineer, his contributions to rebuilding German industry. It also mentioned briefly that he'd been among German POWs who toured American factories during the war. That experience had shaped his perspective on manufacturing, on quality control, on production systems. He'd brought those lessons home and applied them constructively to peaceful purposes. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a few fellow veterans. Hauptmann Weber, now 78 and in failing health, gave a brief eulogy. He spoke about their shared experiences, about the war, about captivity, about touring the Willow Run plant together. Klaus understood something important, Weber said. Defeat isn't permanent unless you refuse to learn from it. He learned. He brought those lessons home. He helped build a better Germany than the one we'd lost. That's the best any of us could do. The generation that had fought World War II was passing away. With them went direct memory of that conflict, of its causes and costs and consequences. But the lessons remained. They were embedded in institutions, in policies, in the industrial practices that German engineers like Becker had helped establish. The factory tours, intended by American intelligence to demoralize German prisoners, had succeeded in that immediate goal. But they'd also served a longer purpose. They'd educated a generation of Germans about the realities of industrial warfare. They'd created understanding that informed post-war reconstruction and development. By the 1990s, historians examining American psychological operations during World War II identified the factory tours as among the most effective propaganda efforts of the war. Not because they lied or exaggerated, but because they told the truth so comprehensively that it couldn't be denied. German prisoners had seen American production with their own eyes. They couldn't dismiss it as propaganda or exaggeration. They'd walked assembly lines, watched bombers take shape, heard production numbers from officers who had no reason to lie. That direct experience created understanding that shaped their post-war perspectives and influenced German society broadly. The United States had learned its own lessons from wartime production. After the war, the massive industrial infrastructure that had produced weapons turned to civilian goods. The factories that built bombers built airliners. The assembly lines that made tanks made tractors. The production systems that armed millions supplied billions. American prosperity in the post-war decades was built on industrial capacity developed during the war. The same production philosophy that had overwhelmed Germany militarily now overwhelmed global markets economically. American consumer goods flooded the world. American industrial techniques were copied globally. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, was possible because American production capacity could supply both American needs and European reconstruction simultaneously. Some historians have argued that America won World War II primarily through production, that battles and tactics mattered less than industrial output. This is oversimplification. Battles had to be won. Tactics mattered. Leadership was crucial. But underlying all of it was production capacity that enabled America to sustain operations that Germany couldn't match. The German POWs who toured American factories in 1944 had witnessed this truth directly. They'd seen the source of American military power. They'd understood, perhaps better than many Americans, what that production capacity represented. It wasn't just about building more weapons, it was about creating industrial systems that could sustain any effort indefinitely. When Klaus Becker first saw the Willow Run plant, when he watched that assembly line producing bombers every hour, he'd understood immediately. Germany had lost. Not because German soldiers weren't brave or German weapons weren't good, because Germany couldn't sustain industrial warfare against opponents who could outproduce them 10-1. That understanding, born from direct observation, shaped the rest of his life. The story of German POWs touring American factories is ultimately a story about the nature of modern war. It's about how industrial capacity determines strategic outcomes. It's about how production systems matter as much as tactics. It's about how nations that can sustain military operations indefinitely will defeat nations that can't, regardless of tactical skill or individual courage. The German officers who laughed at American aircraft in 1943 weren't laughing by 1944. They'd learned, through bitter experience, that industrial logic defeats tactical brilliance. They'd learned that in modern warfare, the side that can build more weapons faster will prevail. They'd learned that quality without quantity is insufficient. These lessons, purchased through defeat and learned through captivity, informed post-war German development. They shaped how Germany approached manufacturing, how it integrated into international systems, how it thought about conflict and cooperation. The factory tours, intended to demoralize prisoners, ultimately educated them in ways that contributed to building a peaceful and prosperous post-war Germany. On March 15, 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Becker stood at Willow Run and understood that Germany had lost. 43 years later, when he died in a rebuilt Germany that had become an industrial powerhouse in its own right, that understanding had been vindicated. Modern industrial warfare had rules that couldn't be ignored. America had understood those rules, Germany had not. The cost of that failure had been catastrophic defeat. The benefit of learning from that failure had been successful reconstruction. The factories that won World War II produced more than weapons. They produced lessons about industrial capacity, about production systems, about the nature of modern conflict. Those lessons, learned by German prisoners watching American workers build bombers on assembly lines stretching beyond sight, shaped the post-war world. When the last veteran who'd toured those factories passed away, direct memory of that experience died with them. But the lessons remained, embedded in institutions and practices that continue to shape how nations approach industrial production and military power. The thunder of Willow Run, producing a bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, had been the sound of victory. It had also been the sound of the future, of industrial warfare conducted at scales that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. German POWs had heard that sound and understood what it meant. Their understanding, born from stunning realization in American factories, became part of the historical legacy of World War II, a legacy that reminds us that in modern conflict, industrial capacity isn't just important, it's decisive.